All right.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for showing up. I think that Indian food brought up a lot of people. We do have some extra seats in the front. Don't be shy. I don't think we need all of them, but there are some up here. But without further ado, we have our homegrown Ross Hale here in front of us that's going to be talking to us about the importance of stand-ups and breakfasts that we do every morning. So without further ado, take it away, Ross.
All right. Thank you, Joe. So during this talk, I'm going to take you in a time machine back to the early days of Pivotal, which is why I've titled it Pivotal Origins. I feel like I do a whole series of talks on some of the origin stories. So quick agenda. We'll talk about what it was like back then, set the context, get your mind in the right space. Then we'll talk about why we do stand-up, why we do breakfast, and then we can turn it into a big discussion. I'm kind of hoping, I don't think this talk will actually be an hour. It'll probably be much less, and then we can just have a big discussion about how we came to these things and where we might go with them. So, I'm going to try and paint this picture. So in the beginning, back in 2006, when I joined as a developer, during my first stint at Pivotal, it was a little scrappier. Right? Very small operation. We had IKEA desks. There was no climate control whatsoever. And by the way, the IKEA desks were often just the top, like stacked on some cinder blocks or whatever we had around. There was no breakfast. We actually had a full office retro, every single week on Friday. There were about 10 people in the office total. We didn't have any tagline or values. There's no be kind or anything like that, or change how the world builds software. We were just kind of there doing our thing. And stand-up happened basically whenever everybody showed up. We would do stand-up. So, specifically, I'm going to talk about these two, right? Breakfast and the stand-up thing. And to paint the picture, this is kind of what it looked like. And you can see in these photos kind of early indicators of what we do now. Like there's an early CI monitor back there, right? Here's Stevenson. I just put this picture in it because I think it's funny to see Stevenson way back in the day. And Joseph Palermo. This was actually the second office, I think. This was when we had just moved into a more legit space and just started using Macs. Here's an early email station. Just kind of a computer haphazardly on a dresser, plus stand-up. I think I got that condenser mic from Guitar Center to try and give a better stand-up experience. Here's Rob Me, showing somebody how to box. Very young Rob. And in this photo, I think the important thing is we were on PC computers back then. There were no Macs, interestingly, right? It's all PCs, old school hardware. I don't know, some riffraff. So let's talk a little bit about stand-up first. I think this is a good way to set the stage. So I think at the time, there were some things we knew we wanted. So, the origin of this talk was from the retrospective. We're kind of like, hey, why do we do stand-up? And why do we have breakfast? And we were talking about this stuff. So I think, quite simply, there were a few things that we knew that we wanted from stand-up, right? First thing is obvious, we wanted to share context with the group. The second thing is we're all very into XP, so we wanted to follow the book, right? XP Explained. Kent Beck talks about stand-ups, and that's kind of what we were and what we did. So we're like, yeah, we're going to do stand-ups, of course. And at the time, we needed to dynamically allocate pairs, right? And there were definitely some differences back then, right, to the way that we operated as an office and the way that Pivotal operated. For one thing, and even the way that stand-up was done, right? So in those stand-ups, we literally went around the room and every single person talked about what they worked on. So, you can imagine our 9:06 stand-up this morning wouldn't really work. Everybody talks about what they worked on yesterday, what they were going to work on today, and, share anything interesting, right? We actually did allocations in that stand-up as well, and pairing selection, which meant that we actually rotated projects on the daily. So I might be working on one code base today, and tomorrow I'm on some other completely different project, right? That was one of those experiments that we eventually moved away from as a little too much rotation, right? And like I said, stand-up was kind of 9-ish. We didn't really have a formal time for it. And as you can imagine, it did not necessarily lead to the, amazing panoramic, perfect stand-ups that we have today. It looked a little bit different, more haphazard, more casual. And this is kind of how it ended up playing out, right? So, 8:15 a.m., the first super industrious pivot would arrive. And this is probably like the worst case. This is like the day before we decided that something must be done, right? 10:17 a.m., the last bleary-eyed pivot would kind of roll into the office. 10:34 a.m. and be like, hey, we haven't done stand-up yet. Should we do some stand-up? All right. Everybody kind of gets up and stands up. 10:45 a.m., everyone's like, who wants Cafe Madeline? Whole office stands up, and we walk down Market Street for espresso shots and pastries. And then 11:30 a.m., we finally get to some actual meaningful pairing, right? But, we're supposed to be the Navy SEALs of extreme programming. And by the way, this is actually a picture that ran in a tech news site when Pivotal was first kind of unveiled to the world. I just find it hilarious how, like, cut and pasty it looks, like MS Paint style. But anyway, this was supposed to be us, right? So we knew that something had to be done, and we had to get better at stand-up and being productive. So we tried various things. The first thing we tried was the wall of late. And so you can imagine what that looked like. We basically, at the time, very small, cramped office. We had maybe 1 or 2 whiteboards. And basically you'd be late, right? Your name goes up on the wall. And that way everyone can see your name and you feel shamed. And you then, strive to not be late again. And that worked pretty well for a while. For, I'd say, good couple months. People really respected the wall of late. And if you were late, you felt really bad about it. And wouldn't do it again. But pretty soon it got to this point where basically the whole office was on the wall of late, and it really lost its efficacy, right? So, in true iterative agile fashion, we tried something else. The next iteration was punishment by beer. And so for this one, we still had the wall of late, right? But now you could get your name crossed off if you brought a 6-pack of beer to the office, right? And then if you were late, your name would go on again, and you'd buy another 6-pack. And this, got us the beer fridge. So you can see, if you look really carefully, there's beer, right? That was our first introduction. And, the reason there's a photo of this fridge, by the way, is because we were so excited to have a fridge with, like, snacks and drinks. It was, like, super forward-thinking at the time. And I look at this fridge, and I'm like, oh, it's so tiny. We don't even have a dedicated beer fridge here, right? But yeah, so that was like one of the first 6-packs probably that somebody had to bring in for being late. So this worked for a while, right? I'd say months went by and, you'd be late and you'd be like, ah, shoot, now I got to go get the 6-pack of beer, bring it in, you feel bad about it. And, it worked as a deterrent pretty effectively until one day when this guy right here, Damon McCormick, who is Mike McCormick's brother, and, RSA conference attendee, kind of legit hacker, figured out how to hack this system, right? And the way he hacked it is he walked in one morning, wrote his name on the wall of shame, he was late, and then immediately dropped a 6-pack on the table and crossed his name out. And from that moment forward, everybody realized all they had to do was go buy a bunch of 6-packs and just bring them with them when they were late. And the system stopped working after that. And that's when we decided to do breakfast, right? So we said, hey, all these punishment systems seem not to be working. They also feel a little draconian and weird. So let's try giving people incentive to come in instead, right? And the first iteration of breakfast, which I think still to this day is the most effective at getting folks to show up, was that Sherry, the Pivotal COO, would take every single person's individual breakfast order, and then the next day, you would have whatever you wanted waiting for you there with your name on it, right? And so you felt really bad if you didn't show up the next day on time to eat this breakfast that was specially delivered for you. And of course, as we scaled, the idea of taking individual breakfast orders didn't make sense any longer, and we moved to, the catering model that you know and love today. But that was the original intent behind breakfast, right? Was getting people to show up on time. That's how we came up with that idea. And it stuck, right? And I think the reason it's stuck, right, and why both of these things have stuck around, is because we managed to solve the issues that we set out to solve, but along the way we discovered some additional benefits to them, right? For stand-up, right, we wanted to share context with the group, we wanted to follow XP, and of course, no longer do we need to dynamically allocate pairs, we do that differently now, right? But we also figured out that, hey, this makes it much easier to run events and get attendance to these events. We can access the hive mind for help, and as we grew and started occupying multiple offices, we had a way to escalate interestings and helps and share that across the entire company. We started the day energized, right? All at the same time with a nice clap. And importantly, we clearly demarcate when work begins so that we can stick to sustainable pace, right? And not have people, showing up and leaving at different times. And then I think for breakfast, we did achieve the initial goal of we get people to stand up on time, but we also, found out that everybody gets properly nourished, right? And therefore is more productive. I think there's a really good opportunity to bond with your team at the breakfast table. That's a big value that we've discussed at Retro. And it's a great opportunity to just meet new teams and people and cross-pollinate, right? So I think that, again, the point of this talk is kind of why stand-up and why breakfast, and so I wanted to tell the origin stories. But the thing that I think is really interesting about this is just stuff we came up with, right? As a scrappy little office of 10 people, being uncomfortably close to each other, and having constant retrospectives every week. So, today, I think that what I'd love to see is continued innovation around things like this and everything else, right? Again, we didn't discover these, thou shalt have stand-up on a stone tablet written somewhere. It's just kind of stuff we came up with to solve problems. Then we experimented with it and discovered that these were really valuable and kind of iterated our way into even better solutions than the ones we initially came up with, right? So I think my challenge for you, whether you're, Pivotal, CoreLogic, other customer, whoever, as part of these agile teams, is constantly be thinking about how can we innovate. Back then, in these early days, and I don't have another photo there. In those early days, everybody thought that everything we were saying was pretty crazy, right? Whether it was like brand new startup, enterprise, everyone was like, pairing, that's nuts. It's twice as expensive. Testing takes you twice as long, right? All these things were kind of crazy, right? I think now we're at a time where a lot of these practices and just agile in general has really captured the attention of, software development at large. But I think the temptation there is that we then just start to follow the pre-existing practices and pre-existing, kind of agile tenets as prescribed and stop innovating. So my challenge, especially for this year, is, how do we think about some of these things and how do we innovate and push and try experiments and keep trying, right? So anyway, with that, discuss. Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is basically, within an enterprise setting, how can we sell the notion of breakfast and the cost associated to leadership and basically get them to make the investment, right? And I think you could definitely put together some cases for, what is the cost of an hour's worth of productivity for the entire, say, product development organization, right? And measure that against the cost of breakfast. Assume that providing breakfast is at least going to get you kind of an extra hour, and it's probably much more of that, of productive time. And what's that cost difference, right? Looking at it that way, you're actually making money. So I think you can, if you need to, right, actually apply some hard dollar figures to these things and the benefit, right?
When people came in, like at different times, did they generally stay 8 hours from when they came in, or they generally leave all at 6?
It was like all over the place. I think, yeah, some people would just leave at 6. Some people would continue working, however long. I think, it was not as disciplined and rigorous as it is today, right?
Given the staggered times between like the early and late folks, and you were doing, I guess, pair allocations at stand-up, how did you deal with that? Like, what were they doing for the first hour or two? Were they working on the project from the day before? Or, like,
Yeah, they'd usually just kind of pick up where they left off, right? So it'd be like roll in, you're like, oh yeah, I was doing this thing yesterday, kind of do it. Or you might just be like hacking around or reading a book, yeah. Desmond.
So I think this topic came up a couple times in the office retro that was Rob and David running with people having breakfast at the tables. It seems like we're effectively bringing people in on time, but a lot of us are eating at our desks or doing something less social during that time. It seems like a great opportunity for this sort of unstructured social time, in particular to get outside of our little teams and go across disciplines, sales, delivery, cloud foundry, all these things that I'm guessing for non-pivotal groups here, maybe that's also a nice thing. Have that time. How can we make that more effective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the question was, and I forgot to repeat an earlier one or a couple earlier ones, but this question was basically, the benefits of having us all eat breakfast together and meet new people and kind of go across organizational boundaries are obvious, but a lot of people aren't doing that, right? They go back and go to their desks and eat. And to me, I think the important thing about these stories and the reason I wanted to tell them is that it wasn't Rob who was coming in and prescribing any of this stuff and saying, here's the experiment we're going to run, there's a wall of late. It was all us just coming up with this stuff and then trying it, right? So I totally agree. I see great value in having everybody get together in the morning and spend time having breakfast, right? In terms of a solution, right, I would say, let's think of some ideas, or, I'd love to see you all think of some ideas for how to incentivize people to do that, right? And try them out and iterate. It's almost like by virtue of my position, I don't want to be the one who's putting forth the ideas. I want it to come from you guys, right? And I think it's not that we're not doing that. I think there's tons of that. Like I came in the other day and I saw these like placards hanging up above the clusters. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I didn't know that was happening. You all just did it. That's great. That's exactly the culture we want. But I think some of these things we hold as very sacred. And, even those are just ideas that we had, and we can push on them, right? Judiciously.
Comparing a small stand-up, at the start of like 10 to 20 people, it's a very different environment to a stand-up where there are now, 800 people. Do you think that there's the same value, or how can you add more value to a stand-up when there's so many more people and you lose some of that intimacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is basically, back then we had 10, 20 people in the stand-up. Now we have 80, sometimes probably 100. How do we make that valuable for everybody? And I think that, the last time we iterated on it was coming up with let's do interestings, helps, and events. And let's have a stand-up grand master who keeps everybody on task. It might be that we come up with a new experiment, maybe change it up just for the sake of changing it up and making it fresh. So that's another area that I'd love to see some ideas. And we can try that. We can, really just try it out for a week, do a little retro, see how we feel, and then either keep it or throw it away, right? Joe.
Pivotal has recently gone public, and I know before that you've been cutting down on costs. Have you heard of anything about breakfast being under attack, or do you think
Yeah, so the question is, now that Pivotal is a public company, and like all public companies has to think about costs, is there a world in which we would stop serving breakfast? My answer is that I would be very surprised, just because I think, again, Rob was there, right? He's the CEO. He saw this all happen. I think that it's considered a pretty core part of our identity. and serves a very real purpose. So the only way I would ever see us getting away from that is if we, through experimentation at the grassroots level, come up with something else, right? Some other way of solving the problem, or just deem it unworthy. But I don't see that coming as kind of a cost-saving measure. The other thing is, well, yeah, I would be really surprised. But you never know. So.
As you guys have grown and distributed teams, how do you feel like, I guess there's two parts to this. Do you feel that each office has created their own identity? And two, how do you keep that same natural company spread of information going through the office?
Yep. So basically the question is, as we've grown and have, 20 plus locations around the world now, how do we keep the right balance between each office having its own identity and having there be a natural spread or kind of the same pivotal at every location, right? Is that basically the question? Yeah. So it's a great question. I definitely think there's an identity to each office. I think that's a thing. I think that's healthy. I think that the way that we innovate, by necessity, you need to have deviation in order to innovate. That actually is a great way to innovate, because then we have natural controls for all of our experiments and all these other offices. However, drift too far, and pretty soon, we have customers that span multiple offices. CoreLogic is a great example, right? In Dallas, LA, San Francisco back in the day, right? It's important that the values and the principles are consistent across. So, it's definitely something we think about. We have a practices council now for each practice that really, their main purview is trying to ensure some level of consistency, or the right level of consistency among these practices across all the different offices at Pivotal, right? I think, the fact that there's a fair amount of cross-pollination helps as well. We tend to send people around to do stints in different offices. That's pretty helpful. I think it's something we actually don't call out as very valuable when folks travel, but I've seen us adopt things that we learned about in other offices and vice versa. There's a bunch of ways, but it's definitely something we're thinking about. I suppose right now it doesn't feel like an issue. I think it's pretty consistent, and we still have those very strong seeds of the culture that we built back in the day. It'll be interesting to see if there is some tipping point, if we get to 10,000 people or 100,000 people, where that starts to be more difficult to maintain, right? But we haven't hit it yet.